The Western Sahara War, 1975 till present. Morocco versus the Polisario Front. We talk about war in the hope that men may learn to honorably avoid it. The background before Western Sahara existed. The pre-colonial world before the 19th century. Long before maps drew hard lines across the Sahara, the land that would later be called Western Sahara existed as a space rather than a state. It was a vast, arid corridor between the Atlantic coast and the deep interior of northwest Africa, a region defined less by borders than by movement. The people who inhabited this space were the Sahrawi tribes, largely Arab-Berber in origin, bound together by lineage, custom, and the Hassaniya Arabic dialect that distinguished them from their northern and southern neighbors. Identity was not rooted in fixed towns or capitals, but in genealogy and terrain, knowing which wells could be trusted, which grazing lands were seasonally safe, and which routes could carry caravans across hundreds of kilometers of open desert. Social organization revolved around tribal confederations, often reinforced by religious brotherhoods, zawiyas, that provided spiritual authority, mediation, and education. These religious networks were not merely spiritual institutions. They were stabilizing forces in a harsh environment, arbitrating disputes, organizing protection, and maintaining continuity across generations. Economically, survival depended on mobility. Sahrawi life was sustained by nomadic pastoralism, particularly camel and goat herding, trans-Saharan caravan trade, linking sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Mediterranean world. Caravans carried salt, gold, slaves, and textiles, and in doing so, embedded Western Sahara into wider regional economies without ever requiring a centralized political authority. Power flowed along routes, not from capitals. As a result, political authority was diffuse. Leadership rested with tribal elders, religious figures, and respected lineages. There was no standing army, no bureaucracy, and no fixed seat of government. Governance was situational and negotiated, shaped by alliances and necessity rather than codified law. This absence of a centralized state did not mean the absence of identity. A coherent Sahrawi identity existed, rooted in shared language, customs, kinship, and an intimate relationship with the land. Belonging was defined by who you were and where you moved, not by passports or borders. Pre-colonial claims and the roots of dispute. Centuries later, this fluid political reality would become the foundation of competing historical claims. Morocco would argue that parts of Western Sahara had long fallen within its historical sphere. The basis for this claim rested on two pillars. First was the concept of bay'ah, an oath of allegiance that some Sahrawi tribal leaders had, at various points, pledged to Moroccan sultans. Second were the undeniable religious, commercial, and cultural ties that linked Saharan tribes to northern Moroccan cities through trade routes, scholarship, and pilgrimage. From Morocco's perspective, these ties suggested continuity of authority and influence stretching southward into the desert. However, the counterargument, later upheld by international legal reasoning, was decisive in its distinction. Allegiance did not equal sovereignty. Bay'ah was personal, symbolic, and often transactional. It did not imply permanent territorial control, administrative governance, or exclusive authority. The same Sahrawi tribes that acknowledged Moroccan sultans at times also maintained comparable relationships with Mauritanian emirates and Algerian religious centers. Allegiances overlapped, sovereignty did not. This ambiguity was not a flaw of Sahrawi society. It was its defining feature. Authority in the pre-colonial Sahara was plural, layered, and non-exclusive. Yet it was precisely this fluidity that later allowed modern states to project backward, reinterpret history, and transform networks of influence into claims of ownership. What had once been a flexible, negotiated political landscape would, under colonial and post-colonial pressures, become a battlefield of maps, treaties, and competing narratives. And that unresolved ambiguity would eventually ignite one of Africa's longest-running conflicts. Colonial intervention. Spain enters, 1884 to 1975. Spain and the invention of Spanish Sahara. European involvement in Western Sahara did not begin with conquest or settlement, but with paper claims drawn in distant capitals. In 1884, During the height of the scramble for Africa, Spain declared a protectorate over portions of the Saharan Atlantic coast. This move coincided with the Berlin Conference, where European powers partitioned Africa with little regard for the societies that already existed there. Spain's initial claim was shallow. It controlled coastal enclaves rather than the interior, planting flags and trading posts along the shore, while the desert beyond remained firmly under Sahrawi control. The territory was eventually formalized as Spanish Sahara, a colonial label imposed on a land that had never known centralized rule. For decades, Spanish authority was largely symbolic. The interior was vast, hostile, and economically unrewarding by early colonial standards. Sahrawi tribes continued their nomadic lives, negotiating with Spanish officials when necessary, resisting when pressured, and largely operating beyond colonial reach. It was not until the 1930s through the 1950s that Spain began to establish something resembling effective control. This shift was driven not by civilizing ambition, but by strategic calculation. Spain's interests were threefold. First, the Atlantic coastline mattered. Control of the coast provided maritime reach, naval positioning, and access to trade routes along West Africa at a time when European empires were obsessed with sea power. Second, the territory's fishing waters proved economically valuable. Spanish fleets relied heavily on Saharan coastal fisheries, turning the region into a quiet but important food source for the metropole. Third, and most decisively, was the discovery of phosphates. In 1947, massive phosphate deposits were identified at Bucra, transforming Spanish Sahara from a peripheral possession into a strategically valuable asset. Phosphates were critical for fertilizer production, linking the territory directly to global agricultural supply chains. From that moment, Spain's presence hardened. Infrastructure followed: roads, mines, administrative centers, and security forces. The colonial relationship shifted from nominal occupation to resource-driven control. Decolonization pressure and the awakening of Sahrawi politics, 1950 to 1970. The end of World War II marked the beginning of the end for European colonial empires. Across Africa and Asia, independence movements surged, fueled by anti-colonial ideology, returning soldiers, and a changing global order. The United Nations emerged as a central actor in this transformation. Decolonization became not just a political trend, but an international norm. Colonial territories were scrutinized, listed, and pressured towards self-determination. In 1963, Spanish Sahara was formally placed on the UN list of non-self-governing territories. This designation was more than symbolic. It meant that Spain was now internationally obligated to prepare the territory for self-rule or independence, rather than indefinite colonial administration. At the same time, Sahrawi political consciousness began to crystallize. Several forces converged. Increased Spanish administrative presence disrupted traditional life. Wage labor in mines and towns exposed Sahrawis to new political ideas. Regional independence movements in Algeria, Morocco, and Mauritania demonstrated that colonial rule could be challenged and defeated. By the 1960s and early 1970s, Sahrawi activism evolved from localized grievances into organized political expression. Early protest movements were met with repression, but they laid the groundwork for more structured resistance. What had once been a loosely governed colonial space was becoming a political problem Spain no longer wanted to manage. Under growing UN pressure, facing rising Sahrawi mobilization, and weakened internally by the decline of the Franco regime, Spain began searching for an exit. But rather than completing a clean decolonization through a referendum, Spain would soon choose a path that transferred the problem, intact and unresolved, to others. That decision would ignite the modern Western Sahara conflict. The birth of the Polisario Front, 1973. From protest to armed struggle. By the early 1970s, patience among young Sahrawis had collapsed. For more than a decade, Spain had spoken the language of reform and gradual self-determination while tightening its grip on the territory's resources. Peaceful petitions, labor protests, and appeals to international law had produced little beyond surveillance, arrests, and repression. The promise of decolonization felt increasingly hollow. Out of this frustration emerged a new generation, younger, politically conscious, and radicalized by delay. Many had studied abroad or been exposed to revolutionary movements sweeping across Africa and the Arab world. Algeria's War of Independence, in particular, loomed large as a proof that colonial power could be broken through armed resistance. On May 10, 1973, this generation crossed a decisive threshold. A small group of Sahrawi activists gathered in secrecy to form the Polisario Front, formally named the Popular Front for the Liberation of Seguia El Hamra and Rio de Oro. The name itself was deliberate and symbolic, invoking the two colonial administrative regions of Spanish Sahara and asserting a unified territorial claim. The organization was built around two uncompromising objectives: the use of armed struggle as the primary means to end Spanish colonial rule, full independence for Western Sahara, no autonomy arrangements, no partial sovereignty, and no external trusteeship. At its core, Polisario rejected the idea that liberation would be granted. It would have to be taken. El Wali Mustafa Sayed and revolutionary leadership. At the center of the movement stood El Wali Mustafa Sayed, a charismatic and disciplined leader whose influence shaped Polisario's identity in its formative years. El Wali embodied the synthesis Polisario sought: deeply rooted in Sahrawi society, politically educated and ideologically sharp, fluent in both traditional legitimacy and modern revolutionary language. Under his leadership, Polisario framed the Sahrawi struggle not as a tribal dispute or regional grievance, but as a national liberation movement aligned with global anti-colonial currents. El Wali emphasized discipline, collective leadership, and political education. The movement was not to be a loose insurgency, but an organization capable of governing once independence was achieved. The first shots, 1973 to 1975. Within weeks of its founding, Polisario moved from declaration to action. Between 1973 and 1975, the movement launched a series of guerrilla attacks against Spanish military positions, targeting patrols, outposts, and supply routes. These operations were modest in scale but powerful in symbolism. For the first time, Spain faced an organized Sahrawi armed resistance rather than isolated unrest. The tactics reflected the environment: small, mobile units, deep knowledge of desert terrain, hit-and-run operations designed to exhaust and unsettle a conventional force. Spain, already overstretched and politically fragile at home, found itself confronting a conflict it had neither the will nor the clarity to fight decisively. The struggle had begun, but Spain would not be the last power Polisario would face. The critical turning point, 1975. Spain's exit, decolonization in name only. By 1975, Spain no longer had the capacity or the appetite to manage Western Sahara. The Franco regime was collapsing from within. General Francisco Franco was gravely ill, the political future of Spain was uncertain, and the state's priority had shifted inward toward survival and transition. In this moment of weakness, Western Sahara became a liability. Spain faced mounting pressure from the United Nations to complete decolonization through a self-determination referendum, as required under international law. At the same time, it confronted growing Sahrawi resistance on the ground and competing territorial claims from Morocco and Mauritania, both eager to fill the vacuum Spain would leave behind. Rather than arbitrate these pressures through a clean and internationally supervised process, Spain chose speed over legality. A referendum would have taken time, political will, and confrontation, both with Sahrawi nationalists and with neighboring states. Spain wanted none of that. The objective became a rapid withdrawal, even if it meant transferring the problem rather than resolving it. This decision, to exit without completing decolonization, created the conditions for everything that followed. The ICJ opinion: law speaks, power listens elsewhere. As the crisis escalated, the United Nations General Assembly sought legal clarity. It turned to the International Court of Justice, ICJ, and posed a deceptively simple question: did Western Sahara belong to Morocco or Mauritania prior to Spanish colonization? The answer, delivered in October 1975, was careful, nuanced, and ultimately inconvenient for those seeking annexation. The ICJ acknowledged that certain Sahrawi tribes had historical ties to Moroccan sultans, some forms of allegiance and influence had existed. But the court drew a sharp legal line. It rejected the claim that these ties amounted to sovereignty. Neither Morocco nor Mauritania, the court ruled, had exercised territorial authority over Western Sahara sufficient to negate the principle of self-determination. The conclusion was explicit. The Sahrawi people possessed the right to decide their own political future. The appropriate mechanism was a free and genuine expression of their will. In legal terms, the path forward was clear. In political terms, it was ignored. The ICJ had spoken, but it had no enforcement arm. The ruling clarified the law, but power would decide the outcome. The Green March, law overrun by spectacle. Within weeks of the ICJ opinion, King Hassan II of Morocco executed one of the most audacious political maneuvers of the Cold War era. In November 1975, Morocco launched the Green March. Approximately 350,000 Moroccan civilians, accompanied discreetly by military forces, advanced toward Western Sahara. They carried Qur'ans and flags, not weapons, at least in appearance. The march was choreographed as a peaceful, patriotic reclamation of land portrayed as historically Moroccan. The message was unmistakable. Morocco would not wait for a referendum. Sovereignty would be asserted through mass mobilization and fait accompli. Spain, politically paralyzed and unwilling to escalate militarily, folded. On November 14, 1975, Spain signed the Madrid Accords with Morocco and Mauritania. The agreement transferred administrative control of Western Sahara without consulting the Sahrawi population and without fulfilling Spain's obligations under international law. The territory was divided. Morocco took the northern two-thirds. Mauritania assumed control of the southern third. The Sahrawis were not present. They were not signatories. They were not consulted. They were not allowed to vote. This was the decisive agenda hijack. Decolonization was replaced with partition. Self-determination was replaced with occupation. International law was overtaken by political momentum. From this moment onward, the conflict ceased to be a question of Spanish colonial withdrawal and became a regional war over legitimacy, territory, and identity, one that would last decades and remain unresolved. 1975 was not just a turning point. It was the moment the conflict became structurally permanent. Then war breaks out, from 1975 to 1991. From betrayal to armed confrontation. The signing of the Madrid Accords in late 1975 did not end colonial rule. It replaced it with occupation. For the Polisario Front, the message was unmistakable. The Sahrawi future would not be decided by law or referendum, but by force. In February 1976, Polisario formally proclaimed the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, Sahara. The declaration was both symbolic and strategic. It asserted continuity with the anti-colonial struggle and reframed the conflict as a war between a people claiming statehood and external powers occupying their land. Almost immediately, the conflict regionalized. Algeria emerged as Polisario's principal backer. Algiers recognized Sahara and provided military training, weapons, and logistical support, territorial sanctuary in southwestern Algeria. As Moroccan and Mauritanian forces advanced, tens of thousands of Sahrawi civilians fled eastward under aerial bombardment. They settled in what would become the long-standing refugee camps around Tindouf, where Polisario established parallel institutions, schools, courts, and administrative structures, laying the foundations of a state in exile. The war thus acquired both a military front and a humanitarian dimension that would endure for decades. A Cold War battlefield by proxy. The Western Sahara conflict unfolded within the broader logic of the Cold War, and external alliances hardened accordingly. Morocco, positioned as a stable monarchy and pro-Western ally, received diplomatic, military, and intelligence support from France, which viewed Morocco as a key Francophone anchor in North Africa, the United States, which prioritized regional stability and containment of revolutionary movements. Polisario, by contrast, aligned with states that framed the struggle as anti-imperialist. Algeria, driven by both ideological solidarity and strategic rivalry with Morocco, Libya, which provided intermittent support during the late 1970s. These alignments did not simply supply weapons. They shaped the limits of the war. Neither side was permitted by its patrons to escalate into a conflict that might destabilize the entire region. Mauritania's War and Exit, 1976 to 1979. Mauritania entered the conflict as the weakest participant and paid the highest immediate price. Polisario forces targeted Mauritanian military installations, railways, and economic assets, including operations near Nouakchott. The attacks exposed Mauritania's limited capacity to fight a mobile desert war and destabilized its already fragile political system. By 1979, the cost had become unsustainable. Mauritania signed a peace treaty with Polisario, formally renouncing all territorial claims to Western Sahara. It withdrew its forces and exited the conflict entirely. The withdrawal did not create peace. Morocco moved quickly to annex the vacated southern zone, extending its control and deepening the confrontation with Polisario. The war narrowed from a three-party conflict into a direct, prolonged struggle between Morocco and the Sahrawi movement. The Desert War, mobility versus fortification. In the late 1970s, the military balance favored Polisario. The movement relied on highly mobile guerrilla units, mounted on light vehicles, capable of striking deep behind Moroccan lines and disappearing into the desert. Intimate knowledge of terrain, supply routes, and seasonal conditions allowed Polisario to inflict significant losses on a larger, conventional army. Moroccan forces, spread thin across vast distances, struggled to adapt. Casualties mounted, morale wavered, and the cost of maintaining control over the territory escalated. Morocco's response was strategic rather than tactical. Between 1980 and 1987, Morocco constructed what would become the defining military feature of the conflict, the sand berm. Stretching approximately 2,700 kilometers, the berm was not a single wall but a layered defensive system. Earthen embankments, extensive minefields, radar and surveillance systems, garrison troop positions, and rapid response units. The berm reshaped the war. It effectively divided Western Sahara into two unequal spaces. Roughly 80%, including major towns and resources, fell under Moroccan control. The remaining eastern zone, sparsely populated and economically marginal, remained under Polisario influence. This transformation ended the era of mobile warfare. Large-scale raids became costly and rare. The conflict hardened into a strategic stalemate, where territory changed little, casualties declined, but resolution receded further into the distance. From war to waiting. By the late 1980s, neither side could achieve decisive victory. Polisario had proven it could not be eliminated. Morocco had ensured it would not be expelled. Exhaustion, diplomatic pressure, and shifting global politics, especially the approaching end of the Cold War, opened space for mediation. In 1991, a UN-brokered ceasefire froze the battlefield. The guns fell mostly silent, but the conflict did not end. It simply entered its longest phase, waiting without resolution. Ceasefire and the UN process, 1991. When the war paused, but did not end. By 1991, the Western Sahara War had reached a point of mutual exhaustion. 15 years of fighting had produced no victor, only hardened positions, displaced populations, and a militarized desert divided by earthworks and mines. Against this backdrop, the United Nations stepped in as mediator. That year, a UN-brokered ceasefire brought large-scale hostilities to a halt. The agreement was built around a clear trade-off. Arms would be silenced in exchange for a political solution. To oversee this transition, the UN established MINURSO, the United Nations Mission for the Referendum in Western Sahara. MINURSO's mandate was unusually specific and deceptively simple. Monitor the ceasefire, identify eligible voters, organize and supervise a referendum on self-determination. The logic was straightforward. Once Sahrawis voted, the conflict would dissolve into legitimacy. But the referendum, the very purpose of the ceasefire, never took place. What followed was not peace, but institutional suspension. A war paused indefinitely, with its resolution trapped inside procedural arguments. The voter question, where the process broke. The failure of the UN process did not stem from a lack of plans or goodwill. It collapsed around a single, decisive issue: who had the right to vote? For Polisario, the answer was non-negotiable. The electorate, it argued, should be drawn from the 1974 Spanish census, the last comprehensive population count conducted before Spain's withdrawal. That census, in Polisario's view, represented the closest approximation of the indigenous Sahrawi population prior to occupation and demographic manipulation. Morocco rejected this approach. Rabat insisted that eligibility extend beyond the Spanish census to include members of Sahrawi tribes living outside the territory. In 1974, tens of thousands of Moroccan settlers who had since moved into Western Sahara, individuals claiming ancestral or tribal ties to the region. This disagreement was not technical, it was existential. Who voted would determine the outcome. Bureaucracy as battlefield. The dispute transformed Minurso's work into a slow-motion struggle over identity. Voter identification missions stretched on for years. Claims were filed, challenged, appealed, and reappealed. Tribal genealogies were scrutinized. Oral histories were weighed against colonial records. Each side contested thousands of individual cases, knowing that even small shifts in numbers could alter the final result. What had once been fought with weapons was now fought with documents, registries, and procedural objections. As delays accumulated, momentum evaporated. The UN lacked the authority to impose a solution. Minurso could observe, mediate, and report, but it could not compel compliance or redefine its mandate without Security Council consensus. That consensus never materialized. Gradually, the referendum process stalled completely. The frozen outcome. By the mid-1990s, the ceasefire had hardened into a new reality. No war, no referendum, no political settlement. Minurso remained on the ground, monitoring a ceasefire that had become an end in itself rather than a means to resolution. For Morocco, time worked in its favor, allowing deeper integration of the territory. For Polisario and the Sahrawi refugees, time meant waiting without agency. The UN process did not fail loudly. It failed quietly, through delay, dispute, and the absence of enforcement. And in that quiet failure, the Western Sahara conflict entered its longest phase, a peace without self-determination. From war to frozen conflict, 1991 to 2020. The diplomatic battlefield. When the guns fell silent in 1991, the Western Sahara War did not end. It mutated into diplomacy. The ceasefire created a new arena, one of negotiation, legal claims, and global alliances rather than desert combat. The stakes were no less existential. The future of the Sahrawi people now depended on political maneuvering, international recognition, and the slow arithmetic of population, settlement, and law. Morocco seized the moment to redefine its claims. Its proposal was framed as pragmatic, autonomy within Moroccan sovereignty. This arrangement would offer Sahrawis limited self-governance, local councils, cultural recognition, perhaps some administrative control, but ultimate authority remained with Rabat. Morocco's logic was both defensive and strategic. Autonomy satisfied the appearance of compromise while preserving control over the land and its resources. Polisario rejected the proposal outright. For the Sahrawi leadership, anything short of full independence was a continuation of occupation. They maintained that the referendum promised by Minurso was not a choice between Morocco and autonomy. It was a vote on statehood for the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, Sahara. Any concession would be a betrayal of the people who had endured decades of displacement, war, and exile. The international community fractured along familiar Cold War and post-Cold War lines. African Union and many Latin American states recognized Sahara as a sovereign state, framing the Sahrawi struggle as a legitimate anti-colonial movement. For them, the issue was a continuation of decolonization and respect for international law. Western powers, including France, the United States, and much of the EU, leaned toward Morocco, backing it de facto, if not explicitly. Their interest was stability in North Africa, strategic access to Atlantic ports, and the containment of any Algerian-backed revolutionary influence. Thus, the battlefield shifted from sand and mines to embassies, UN corridors, and Security Council votes. The war became diplomatic attrition, where time itself was a weapon. Economic and strategic stakes. Beneath the legal arguments and political declarations lay a simpler truth. Western Sahara was economically and strategically valuable. Morocco's annexation was not merely about territorial pride. It was about resources and long-term leverage. Phosphates. The Bukhara mines were among the world's largest phosphate deposits, essential for global fertilizer production. Control over Bukhara meant influence over an international commodity. Fishing waters. The Atlantic coast was rich in fish stocks, providing Morocco with economic revenue and access to food security. Potential offshore energy. Untapped reserves of oil and gas in the continental shelf promised future energy wealth, further raising the stakes. Recognizing these incentives, Morocco embarked on a deliberate policy of integration. Infrastructure, roads, schools, and urban development extended into Western Sahara, bringing Moroccan settlers alongside local populations. Over decades, the demographic and economic landscape was transformed, embedding Moroccan influence in ways that were difficult to reverse even if a political solution emerged. For Polisario and the Sahrawi refugees, these developments were deeply frustrating. The very land they claimed as their homeland was being reshaped under Moroccan authority, solidifying facts on the ground that no UN resolution or ceasefire could easily undo. By the early 21st century, the Western Sahara conflict had entered a new equilibrium, a frozen conflict where military confrontation had largely ceased, but political resolution remained impossible. Morocco consolidated control over the bulk of the territory. Polisario maintained governance in exile, claiming legitimacy through recognition and historical precedent. And the world watched, largely divided, as the legal, moral, and strategic dimensions of the conflict continued to collide. Then conflict resumes, 2020. The Guerrilla incident, a ceasefire tested. Nearly 3 decades of relative calm ended quietly but decisively in November 2020 in the far southwest of Western Sahara at Guerrilla, a dusty border corridor connecting Morocco to Mauritania and the wider Atlantic trade routes. For years, this strip had been the lifeline for commerce, trucks carrying goods between Morocco, Mauritania, and beyond, but it also became a flashpoint in a conflict frozen by geography and bureaucracy. Polisario forces, frustrated by decades of stalled negotiations and a stagnant UN process, blocked the corridor, halting Moroccan trade convoys and asserting their authority over the borderlands. The move was symbolic and strategic. It disrupted Morocco's economic access while signaling that Polisario still controlled parts of the territory and could enforce leverage on the ground. Morocco responded swiftly. Troops were dispatched to reopen the road, backed by mechanized units and logistical support. The operation was calculated, not a full-scale invasion, but a demonstration of the Moroccan state's resolve. Polisario, viewing the incursion as a violation of their claimed territorial sovereignty, declared the 1991 ceasefire null and void. The declaration was not merely rhetorical. It marked a formal resumption of hostilities, although the nature of the fighting would differ dramatically from the pitched battles of the 1970s and 1980s. The return of low-intensity warfare. The renewed conflict quickly settled into a low-intensity pattern. Rather than large-scale, conventional warfare, which Morocco's fortified positions and the sand berm still strongly deterred, Polisario relied on artillery strikes, rocket attacks, and small incursions along the berm. These were precise, tactical actions designed to send political messages, test Moroccan responses, and maintain operational credibility without risking annihilation. Moroccan forces, for their part, continued to fortify defensive positions, relying on the berm, minefields, surveillance systems, and rapid response units to contain attacks. Logistics, intelligence, and air support allowed Morocco to maintain overwhelming control over the territory's bulk, while the eastern and remote regions became contested zones for occasional skirmishes. By design, the war in 2020 was a shadow of its former self, yet deeply consequential. It demonstrated that the conflict was not dormant. Polisario could still act, Morocco could still respond, and the UN-mediated framework remained unable to enforce peace or facilitate a political solution. Guerrilla became a symbolic inflection point, a reminder that decades of frozen conflict had not resolved the underlying dispute, and that the potential for escalation remained whenever either side perceived a threat to its claims, sovereignty, or strategic interests. Major diplomatic shock, 2020 to 2023. The U.S. recognition of Moroccan sovereignty. The frozen stalemate of Western Sahara was jolted into a new phase in December 2020, when the United States formally recognized Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. The move came as part of a broader geopolitical package, Morocco's normalization of relations with Israel, a deal brokered by the Trump administration. This recognition represented a dramatic departure from decades of American neutrality. For nearly half a century, the U.S. had publicly supported a negotiated solution under UN auspices. emphasizing self-determination while avoiding explicit sovereignty claims. That stance had lent legitimacy to the UN process, even as it stalled. With this announcement, the U.S. effectively shifted the balance of international legitimacy toward Morocco. The immediate effects were profound. Morocco's position strengthened. The recognition provided diplomatic cover for Morocco to consolidate control over the territory, justify settlement policies, and maintain its claim despite Polisario resistance. It also reinforced Morocco's narrative that autonomy under Moroccan sovereignty was the only viable solution. UN leverage weakened. MINURSO's mandate, already stalled by voter disputes, became increasingly toothless. Without backing from a major power, the UN could not compel Morocco to comply with the referendum framework or push substantive negotiations. Regional tensions deepened. Algeria, the primary backer of Polisario, perceived the U.S. decision as a direct affront. The recognition intensified Algerian-Moroccan rivalry, exacerbating tensions along borders, in diplomatic forums, and across North African alliances. Algeria condemned the move as a violation of international law and Sahrawi rights, framing it as an intervention that undermined decades of UN mediation. The U.S. announcement also had global ripple effects. Many European countries, while careful not to overtly break with UN principles, tacitly adjusted policies toward Morocco, weighing strategic partnerships, energy considerations, and regional stability against legal and ethical imperatives. In short, the 2020 U.S. recognition did more than shift a diplomatic position. It reshaped the conflict's international architecture. Morocco emerged with stronger backing. Polisario faced diminishing leverage, and the UN-led process was left in a state of near-permanent suspension. The Western Sahara dispute, long frozen in military stalemate, now entered a new phase of high-stakes diplomacy, where external powers could alter the balance on paper, even as the Sahrawi struggle continued on the ground. Key players, forces shaping the conflict. The Western Sahara conflict is as much about people and power as it is about land. Understanding the key players illuminates why resolution has remained elusive. Morocco has long pursued a strategy of territorial consolidation and strategic depth. From King Hassan II, who orchestrated the Green March and annexed the territory in 1975, to King Mohammed VI, who has modernized administrative and economic integration, Morocco's leadership frames Western Sahara as essential to national integrity, security, and access to resources. For Morocco, the stakes are existential. Relinquishing the territory would not just be a loss of land, but a blow to the monarchy's legitimacy and regional influence. Polisario Front and the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, Sadr, embody the Sahrawi aspiration for full independence. Leadership has evolved through decades of struggle. El Wali Mustafa Sayed, founder, set the revolutionary and organizational framework. Mohammed Abdelaziz consolidated governance in exile and led the movement through the frozen conflict era. Brahim Ghali, the current Secretary General, navigates a landscape dominated by diplomacy and international law rather than battlefield victories. Algeria plays the role of a regional counterbalance. Its support for Polisario, military, financial, and diplomatic, is motivated by a long-standing rivalry with Morocco. Beyond solidarity with Sahrawis, Algeria seeks to prevent Morocco from consolidating unchecked influence in Northwest Africa, ensuring that its own strategic position in the Maghreb remains secure. Finally, the United Nations functions as mediator and custodian of legality. Through MINURSO, it monitors ceasefires and oversees peace processes, but its limited enforcement power leaves it largely dependent on the goodwill of the parties. It can facilitate, observe, and report, but cannot compel compliance, leaving the Sahrawi and Moroccan positions locked in a procedural limbo. Why the conflict persists? Despite decades of negotiation, the Western Sahara dispute endures because structural incentives outweigh the costs of resolution. 1. No military solution is feasible without a regional war. Morocco's fortifications, Polisario's mobility, and Algeria's backing create a balance where decisive victory would require a conflict far larger than either side, or the international community, is willing to accept. 2. UN mechanisms lack enforcement. MINURSO and international resolutions cannot impose referenda or sovereignty decisions. compliance depends entirely on the political will of actors with entrenched interests. 3. Strategic resources incentivize the status quo. Phosphates, fisheries, potential offshore energy, and trade corridors make the territory valuable to Morocco. For Polisario, the very existence of these assets under Moroccan control justifies continued resistance. For great powers prioritize stability over justice. Western nations, concerned with regional security, migration, and Cold War-style alliances, often side tacitly with Morocco, reducing the leverage of international law or Sahrawi claims. The result is a conflict that persists not because it is unsolvable, but because powerful incentives lock it in place. Strategic takeaway: Western Sahara is not a forgotten war by accident. It is a managed stalemate, carefully balanced at multiple levels. Law exists without enforcement. International rulings and UN resolutions recognize Sahrawi rights, but remain impotent in practice. Identity exists without sovereignty. The Sahrawi people maintain cultural and political cohesion, yet lack territorial authority. Peace exists without resolution. Ceasefires prevent large-scale bloodshed, but no settlement has addressed the underlying question of sovereignty. In essence, the conflict illustrates how modern territorial disputes can be suspended indefinitely, a space where diplomacy, strategic interests, and regional rivalries substitute for decisive outcomes. It is a cautionary tale of how power, law, and identity can coexist in tension, producing a peace that is neither final nor fully just, but deeply durable. Please subscribe, like, and share.